The late afternoon sun cast a warm golden glow over James Carter's backyard, illuminating a scene that could have graced the cover of a gardening magazine. Perfectly trimmed hedges framed a lush, emerald lawn, while a VY Brant flower bed burst with crimson roses his late wife Emily's pride and joy. James leaned against the weathered wooden railing of his porch, a crisp sheet of paper trembling slightly in his hand. The ink was still fresh, the words stark and demanding. A DULA 500 fine from the Homeowners Association for his unauthorized flower bed. He squinted at the notice, incredulity tightening his jaw. He'd barely unpacked his last MOVYing box, and this was the welcome he got? Across the street, a stocky figure in a garish yellow polo shirt and khaki shorts strutted like a peacock. Harold Kessler, the HOA president, clutched a clipboard as if it were a scepter, issuing citations to neighbors with the smug satisfaction of a petty dictator. James watched as Harold paused beside his golf cart, scribbling furiously, his lips curled into a self-assured grin. The man thrived on control, wielding the HOA rulebook like a cudgel against anyone who dared to question his reign. James straightened, folding the fine in half with deliberate calm. Harold didn't know it yet, but he just picked a fight with a retired federal judge, and James Carter didn't lose. "Excuse me," James called out, stepping off his porch with measured steps. He held up the notice, his voice steady but edged with curiosity. "Mind explaining this?" Harold barely glanced at him, his pen still scratching against the clipboard. "Unauthorized flower bed. Page 12 of the HOA guidelines. All landscaping mods need approval." James raised an eyebrow, his legal mind already dissecting the claim. "Since when do flower beds need approval?" "Since always," Harold snapped, tapping his clipboard with a flourish. "Keeps the neighborhood uniform. You should have read the rules before MOVYing in." "I did," James replied evenly, his gaze unwavering. "And there's nothing about flower beds requiring pre-approval." Harold let out a dry chuckle, crossing his arms. "What are you, a lawyer?" James allowed a faint smile to tug at his lips. "Something like that." Harold leaned in, lowering his voice as if sharing a conspiratorial nugget. "Look, rules are rules. Pay the fine or file an appeal. But I wouldn't bother and never lose." "Is that so?" James met his stare, unflinching. Harold smirked. "It is." James nodded, tucking the notice into his pocket. "Good to know." That evening, James poured himself a glass of bourbon, the amber liquid catching the light as he settled at his desk. He pulled out the HOA bylaws he'd printed before MOVYing in a habit from decades of scrutinizing legal documents. His instincts had been spot on. No mention of flower beds requiring approval. But as he flipped through the pages, something else caught his eye. The fines weren't just random, they were inconsistent. His flower bed warranted a DULA 500 penalty, yet Harold's own property sported overgrown hedges and a tacky mailbox that violated the same guidelines. A neighbor's oversized American flag had earned a citation, but another's garish collection of lawn flamingos stood untouched. James leaned back, the familiar thrill of a case brewing in his chest. It had been months since he'd retired, but this was a challenge worth taking. The next morning, James strolled to Harold's house, a steaming mug of coffee in hand. Harold's yard was a mess, unkempt bushes spilling over the sidewalk, a faded mailbox tilting precariously, and a faint oil stain marring the driveway. James sipped his coffee, cataloging each violation with a prosecutor's precision. "Morning," he greeted as Harold emerged, halfway into his golf cart. Harold frowned, his jowls tightening. "Something I can do for you, Carter?" "Just took your ad VYC," James said, pulling out his phone. "Read the rulebook. Seems enforcement's a bit uneven." Harold's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" James scrolled through his notes, his tone casual but pointed. "Your hedges are a foot too tall, section 3.5. Mailbox is an HOA standard. And that oil stain? Should have been fined weeks ago. Funny how these things slip by." Harold stiffened, his smug veneer cracking. "You threatening me?" "Not at all," James said smoothly. "Just observe VYing." Harold's jaw clenched, but he said nothing, climbing into his cart and speeding off. By noon, a new fine arrived at Harold's doorstep, due law $750 for non-compliant landscaping. James watched from his office window as Harold stormed out, the crumpled notice in his fist, his usual swagger replaced by a flicker of unease. The game was on. That evening, James attended his first HOA meeting, stepping into the community clubhouse with the quiet confidence of a man who'd faced down seasoned attorneys. The room buzzed with a mix of bored homeowners and a few nervous faces. Harold sat at the front, flanked by his bored three, spineless cronies who nodded at his every word. He slammed his gavel with unnecessary force, smirking as he called the meeting to order. "Next up, a violation dispute," Harold announced, his eyes locking onto James. "Mr. Carter, here to contest your fine." James stood, smoothing his jacket. "Yes, and I'd like to clarify." "Just so we're clear," Harold interrupted, his smile dripping with condescension. "This isn't a courtroom, Judge. This is an HOA hearing. Different rules." A few attendees snickered. James suppressed a grin he'd seen this before. Small men mistaking authority for competence. "I'm aware, Mr. Kessler, but rules still matter. The bylaws don't require pre-approval for flower beds." Harold flipped open a folder, jabbing at a page. Page 12. "All exterior modifications need approval." "That refers to structural changes, fences, sheds, patios," James countered. "A flower bed isn't a structure." "Agree to disagree," Harold said, his smirk widening. "The fine stands." James chuckled softly. "You could disagree. The law can't." Harold's expression faltered. Before he could retort, a voice piped up from the Crodan, older woman with a steely gaze. "He's right. I've lived here 15 years. Never needed approval for my roses." Murmurs rippled through the room. Harold banged his gavel, his voice sharp. "That's not up for discussion. Next issue." James sat down, his mind racing. This wasn't just sloppy enforcement, it was deliberate. Harold targeted those who wouldn't push back, wielding fines like a cudgel to maintain his fiefdom. Unfortunately for him, James wasn't the compliant type. Over the next few days, James turned detective. He photographed Harold's violation overgrown hedges, an unapproved deck extension, peeling paint-thin canvas the neighborhood. Stories poured in. A young couple fined due law $800 for a non-compliant porch light, despite identical fixtures on Harold's cronies' homes. An elderly widow hit with a due law $1,200 penalty for a cracked walkway she couldn't afford to fix. The pattern was clear: newcomers and dissenters bore the brunt, while Harold's inner circle skated free. James filed a formal complaint with the HOA compliance officer, a weary man named Greg who seemed to loathe working under Harold. By afternoon, Harold received a due law $900 fine for his deck. The neighborhood hummed with quiet glee. That night, Harold stormed up James's driveway, his face flushed with rage. "You think this is funny?" he snarled, while viewing the violation notice. James set down his bourbon, unfazed. "Not at all. Rules are rules." "You're making a mistake," Harold hissed, stepping closer. James tilted his head, his voice low and steady. "Because I'm following them?" Harold's eyes blazed. "I run this HOA. Keep pushing, and I'll bury you." James smiled faintly. "You already have, Harold. That was your mistake." The next morning, James awoke to a barrage of fine 6 in total. One for his mailbox height, another for his fence color, a third for a birdhouse he'd hung for Emily's beloved cardinals. The rest were absurd. Due law $300 for excessive pollen from his roses. Due law $400 for unapproved porch furniture. James laughed outright, the audacity fueling his resolve. This wasn't about rules, Anna Maria. It was a tantrum from a desperate man, losing control. Sipping his coffee, James opened his laptop and dug into the HOA's financials. As a judge, he'd unraveled corruption schemes more complex than this, and something about Harold's operation reeked. Fines were meant for upkeep, roads, pools, landscaping, but the neighborhood was crumbling. Cracked streets, a shuttered clubhouse pool, faded paint everywhere. Where was the money going? After hours of cross-referencing budgets and complaints, the truth emerged. Nearly 50 fan tram of fine revenue, hundreds of thousands vanished in a thin air. James exhaled sharply. Harold wasn't just a bully. He was a crook. That afternoon, James met with a former colleague, Sarah Gwynn, now an investigative reporter. Over coffee, he laid out the EVY Dents Bank records, falsified reports, homeowner testimonies. Sarah's eyes widened. Kessler, she mused, tapping her pen. I dug into him years ago. Embezzled from an HOA in Raleigh. Slipped out with a settlement. James smirked. Perfect. The next day, he requested a full financial disclosure from the HOA, citing state law. Harold refused, retaliating with a due law $1,500 fine for fictitious driveway damage. James smiled. Harold was unraveling. 2 nights later, security footage captured Harold spray painting fake cracks on a James's driveway under cover of darkness. Checkmate. The following HOA meeting was electric standing room only. Harold strode in, his smugness intact but brittle. James sat near the front, a thick folder in hand. Before we start, Harold began, I'll address the fine concerns. James stood, cutting in. Let's talk about your rules, Harold. I've analyzed your financials. Over 50 fan tram of fines, hundreds of thousands unaccounted for. The room erupted in gasps. James pressed on, voice calm but relentless. Your own violations? Ignored. Hedges too tall, deck unapproved, driveway stained. You fine us for nonsense while pocketing the cash. He held up photos of Harold vandalizing his driveway. And this? Fraud. Illegal. Harold bolted, but the damage was done. By morning, the neighborhood buzzed with outrage. By evening, the police were involved. Harold didn't go quietly. The next day, a foreclosure notice arrived, his last-ditch effort to crush James. It was laughable. James filed 2 lawsuits, one against Harold for fraud and defamation, another against the HOA for mismanagement. Then he called the state attorney's office, tipping them off to the embezzlement. That night, Harold screeched into James's driveway, wild-eyed. You think you're smart? He roared, while VYing the foreclosure letter. I'll ruin you. James leaned against his porch railing, bourbon in hand. Harold, this was never your neighborhood. You're done. He tossed the lawsuit papers at Harold's feet. Fraud. Embezzlement, the state's coming for you. Resign, or it gets worse. Harold froze, the fight draining from him. The next morning, his resignation hit every mailbox. By evening, he was out of the HOA. But James wasn't finished. At the next meeting, packed with furious homeowners, 2 officers marched in mid-speech. Harold Kessler, you're under arrest for fraud and embezzlement. Cheers erupted as he was cuffed and dragged out, his eyes burning into James. James raised his glass silently. Game over. With Harold gone, the HOA crumbled. James presented EVY Denke of years of fraudulent fines, securing refunds for every VY Tim. The association dissolved, replaced by a simple council focused on real community needs. Harold's assets were seized, his wealth redistributed to those he'd bled dry. He got 3 years to light sentence, but justice nonetheless. A month later, James sat on his porch, tending his roses. The neighborhood, Thrive flags waved, gardens bloomed, kids laughed. His phone buzzed. Sarah, another HOA's asking for your help. Corrupt board. You in? James smiled, sipping his bourbon. Retirement, it seemed, was just the beginning. If you were the one in this story, how would you react? Would you stand up and fight back, or accept the unreasonable pressure and control from the HOA? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this VY Deo with more people. Your small action gives us the motivation to keep bringing you more intense and engaging stories. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next VY Deo.